Monday after Thanksgiving, I called my attorney and told her to start the paperwork. All of it. I want to back up, because if I just tell you that part, you'll think I'm a bitter old woman who punishes her family for one bad moment. I'm not. I'd had 63 years to learn the difference between a bad moment and a pattern. What happened at my son's house that Thursday wasn't a moment. It was a mirror, and what I saw in it had been there for a long time. I just hadn't let myself look. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I raised my son alone. His father left when he was 4, and I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it explains everything that came after. I worked. I worked the way women of my generation worked when there was no one else. I took a job as a bookkeeper for a small heating and cooling company in Akron, Ohio, unglamorous. The kind of job you don't tell people at parties, but the owner, a quiet man named Mr. Schaefer, paid me fairly, gave me benefits, and let me learn. Over 22 years, I learned a great deal. What I learned wasn't just bookkeeping. I learned how money moved. I learned how a small business built equity. I watched Mr. Schaefer buy a second location, then a third. I watched him reinvest instead of spend. I watched him drive the same truck for 11 years. And I paid attention. In my own small way, I did the same. I bought my house in 1987 for $61,000. It was not impressive. It needed a new roof within 2 years of purchase, and the kitchen was something out of a 1960s photograph, harvest gold appliances and linoleum that curled at the corners. But it was mine. I fixed what I could fix myself. I learned to tile. I watched library VHS tapes on plumbing. My son thought it was embarrassing the way I'd spend a Saturday in old clothes with grout on my hands instead of taking him to the mall like his friends' mothers did. I took him anyway sometimes, but I also kept the house. When my son graduated high school, I was making $34,000 a year. I had $48,000 in a retirement account and a house that had appreciated quietly, the way houses in stable neighborhoods do when no one is paying attention. I drove a 1994 Buick LeSabre that I'd bought, used, and maintained religiously. I brought my lunch to work every day in a blue insulated bag I'd had since 1991. My son found this humiliating. He never said so directly. He was not unkind, not then. But I noticed the way he'd glance at his friends' mothers, the ones with the newer cars, the salon highlights, the Saturday morning yoga classes, and then look back at me with something in his eyes that I told myself was just adolescent embarrassment. Normal. Every kid goes through it. He'd grow out of it. He went to Ohio State on partial scholarship. I helped with the rest, money I'd been setting aside since he was 7 years old. He graduated with a degree in business administration and got a job in sales at a medical device company in Columbus. He was 23. He called me every Sunday. He came home for Christmas. Things were fine. Then he met her. I'll call her what she is, my daughter-in-law. I'll try to be fair. She was not a bad person when I first met her. She was 26. Pretty quick to laugh, from a family in the Columbus suburbs that had what I would describe as a confident relationship with money. Her father owned a chain of car dealerships. Her mother had never worked outside the home. They vacationed in Hilton Head every summer and referred to it simply as going to the house. I liked her well enough at the beginning. She was warm with my son, and he was clearly in love. I gave them my blessing genuinely. The wedding was beautiful. They bought a house in a suburb called Powell, $380,000, which my son told me proudly over the phone. I asked if they were comfortable with the mortgage payment, given their combined income. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "Mom, we're fine," the way you say it when you don't want to answer the question. I sent a card with a check for $2,000. It was a meaningful amount to me. My daughter-in-law sent a thank you note that said, among other things, that they were so grateful for everyone's generosity. Everyone's. Like it was a collective contribution to a group effort. Her parents gave them $40,000 for the down payment. I know because my son told me, the way he told me a lot of things in those years. Not to share information, but to establish a comparison. I was supposed to feel bad about losing. I did not feel bad. I had learned by then not to measure myself against other people's numbers. The years after the wedding were fine on the surface. My son and daughter-in-law had 2 children, a boy and a girl. My grandchildren, I drove down to Columbus 4 times a year. I babysat when I was asked. I brought practical gifts, good winter coats, educational toys, savings bonds, and the grandchildren's names that I registered through Treasury Direct and tucked into birthday cards with handwritten notes explaining what they were and how to track them. My daughter-in-law received these with a particular expression I came to recognize. Not quite dismissive, more like politely confused, the way you look at a gift that requires explanation. I noticed. I also noticed other things over time. The way my son had shifted, he worked in sales, he understood image, and somewhere in the years of that marriage, he had come to see image as substance. They drove matching SUVs. They renovated the kitchen twice. They joined a country club. My son began to refer to his income in ways that suggested it was larger than I suspected, and to spend in ways that confirmed it wasn't quite as large as the spending implied. I said nothing. It was his life. He was an adult. But I noticed. What I had not told my son, had not told anyone really, was what had happened to my own financial situation in the intervening years. Mr. Schaefer had sold his company in 2003. Before he did, he offered me a small equity stake in exchange for 15 years of loyalty and the fact that, bluntly, I had helped him keep his books clean enough to attract a buyer. I owned 2% of a company that sold for $4.1 million. I walked away with $82,000 after taxes. I put it all into index funds and did not touch it. I had also quietly, over the years, continued to buy property, not dramatically, not a portfolio, a duplex in 1998, a small rental house in 2004, a commercial unit in a strip mall in 2011 that I got at a significant discount because no one else wanted to deal with the difficult tenant on the ground floor. I dealt with the tenant. She turned out to be a reasonable woman who simply needed someone to listen to her instead of threaten her. We had a good landlord-tenant relationship for 9 years. By the time of the Thanksgiving in question, I was 63 years old. I still lived in my original house, which I had paid off in 2009. I still drove a sensible car, a 2017 Honda CR-V that I had bought used in 2019 with cash. I still brought my lunch to work until I retired in 2021. My total net worth, as of the previous spring when my accountant had done a full assessment, was just over $1.9 million. Not extraordinary, not a private jet, but real and solid, and entirely my own. My son did not know any of this. Not because I was hiding it from him exactly, more because he had never asked. He knew I owned my house. He knew I had some savings. He assumed, I think, that I was comfortable in the modest, slightly pinched way that working women of my background were supposed to be comfortable. He had stopped asking about my finances somewhere around the time he joined the country club, in the same way you stop asking about a subject when the answer would require you to reassess something you'd prefer not to reassess. The Thanksgiving was at their house. It always was. My daughter-in-law was a good cook, and she knew it, and the table was beautiful, real linen, actual china, a centerpiece involving dried eucalyptus that I recognized from a home decor tin she followed. My grandchildren were 9 and 6, loud and wonderful. I had brought a pie from a local bakery I liked, and a tin of Christmas cookies from a place my granddaughter had once said she loved. After dinner, when the children were watching a movie in the other room, the adults sat around the table with wine and coffee and the particular loose-limbed ease of people who have eaten too much. My daughter-in-law's parents were there, Her father expansive as always, her mother in a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Her parents had brought wine. Good wine. My son had made a point of mentioning the label. The conversation turned to the grandchildren. My grandson was, everyone agreed, exceptionally bright. He had tested into a gifted program at school. There was talk of private school, of prep programs, of the right trajectory. My daughter-in-law was animated, leaning forward, talking about a private academy she had toured. Her father nodded along. My son nodded along. I listened. Then my daughter-in-law said, in the way she sometimes said things, not cruelly, but carelessly, the way you're careless with things you've never had to be careful about. She said, we'd love for everyone to contribute to his college fund this year. Even small amounts help. Even small amounts. I looked at her. She was refilling her wine glass and did not look back. I said, I actually set up a 529 for him when he was born. It has about 14,000 in it. There was a moment of silence. My daughter-in-law set down the wine bottle. A 529, she said, not a question, more like she was filing it. Yes, I said, the contributions have compounded reasonably well. I've been adding to it every year. How much is in it? My son asked. He seemed genuinely surprised. Right now, a little over 14,000, I said, for each of them. Another silence, different quality this time. I didn't know you'd done that, my son said. You didn't ask, I said, pleasantly, factually. My daughter-in-law's father cleared his throat and said something about the market, a redirect, and the conversation moved. But I had seen it, the look that passed between my daughter-in-law and her mother. Not impressed, not grateful, recalibrating. Trying to figure out what category to put this in, the look of people who have been mildly surprised by something they are not prepared to fully acknowledge. Later, in the kitchen, I was wrapping the leftover pie. My daughter-in-law came in to get more coffee. We were alone. She said without preamble, you know, you really should be thinking about your own retirement security. College funds are generous, but if you ever need care, that money would need to be liquid. I looked at her. I appreciate the thought, I said. I just think... She smiled, the smile of a woman who has been told she is good at giving advice. Sometimes people of your generation hold on to gestures that feel meaningful, but practically speaking, a 529 with 14,000 isn't going to make a difference in the scheme of things. Private school alone is 30,000 a year. I was quiet for a moment. I understand, I said. Thank you for explaining that to me. I wrapped the pie. I rinsed my hands. I dried them on the kitchen towel. I said goodnight to my grandchildren. I hugged my son at the door. He seemed to want to say something. He didn't. I drove home on I-71 in the dark with the radio off. I was not angry. Or rather, I was, but it was the cold, clear kind of anger that doesn't make you want to cry or shout. It makes you want to think. It makes you very calm and very precise. I thought about my daughter-in-law's face when she said a 529 with 14,000 isn't going to make a difference. I thought about the words people of your generation. I thought about my son, nodding along at the table, not saying anything, never saying anything. I thought about 22 years of lunch in a blue insulated bag. I thought about the duplex, the rental house, the difficult tenant who turned out to be reasonable. I thought, they don't know, and they have never tried to know. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I called my attorney. Her name is a detail I'll keep private, but she is a sharp, plain-spoken woman in her late 50s who has handled my affairs for 12 years and has an impressive ability to not look surprised by anything. I told her what I wanted to do. I told her I wanted to restructure my estate documents. I told her I wanted to remove the provisions I had made for my son and redirect the majority of my estate, the properties, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, into a trust for my grandchildren, not for their parents, for them, to be administered by an independent trustee until they were 30, with distributions for education and health only until that point. My attorney did not look surprised. She made notes. She asked several clarifying questions in her practical way. She told me the timeline for completing the documents, quoted me her fee, and sent me home with a list of information she would need. I drove home past the familiar streets of Akron, past the hardware store where I had bought my first set of tiling tools, past the library where I had checked out the plumbing VHS tapes. It was a gray December morning, cold and flat in the way Ohio winters are cold and flat, and I felt, unexpectedly, very peaceful. I want to say something about that peace because I think it's important. It was not vindictive peace. It was not the satisfaction of winning an argument. It was the peace of a woman who had spent a long time being underestimated and had finally decided to stop holding her breath, waiting for it to change. There is something that happens when you stop waiting. The waiting itself was the weight, and when I put it down, I felt lighter than I had in years. My son called the following Sunday, as he always did. We talked about the children. We talked about the weather. He asked if I'd had a good drive home. I said yes. He did not mention Thanksgiving. Neither did I. I want to be honest here. I love my son. I say that not as a disclaimer, but as a central fact. He is the person I have loved most completely in my entire life, and that did not change on a Thursday evening in November. What changed was my willingness to keep hoping that love alone would teach him something it hadn't taught him in 63 years of me demonstrating it. He had watched me work. He had watched me save. He had watched me make do and make peace and make something from nothing, and somewhere along the way he had decided that the making from nothing meant there was nothing there. He had looked at his mother and seen only the Buick and the blue lunch bag and the linoleum that used to curl at the corners, and had never thought to wonder what was underneath. That was his choice to make, but it did not have to be my children's inheritance. The documents were completed in January. I signed them on a cold Tuesday morning in my attorney's conference room, with a cup of coffee and a view of downtown Akron through the window. My attorney handed me my copies in a manila envelope, the way she always hands me things, directly, without ceremony. I put them in my bag. In February, something happened that I had not anticipated. My son called on a Sunday afternoon, which was not unusual, but his voice was different from the first words, quieter. He asked if I had time to talk. I said yes. He said, "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I don't know how to start, so I'm just going to start." He told me that he and his wife were having serious problems. He told me, haltingly, that she had been spending money they did not have, not dramatically, not in any single obvious way, but steadily, persistently, on things that seemed individually reasonable and collectively ruinous. He told me about the second renovation they had done, which had been financed. He told me about the country club membership that had been charged to a credit card he hadn't fully understood. He told me that they were behind on the mortgage. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have listened to you when you asked about the mortgage payment, back when we bought the house." I was quiet too. "I didn't ask to tell you I told you so," I said. "What do you need?" He said he didn't know. He said he thought he needed to figure out a lot of things, and that he wanted to do it himself, but he wanted me to know. I said, "I'm here." And I meant it, not as a financial resource, as his mother. I did not tell him about the estate restructuring, not that day. I told him when the time was right, about 6 weeks later, after he had made several decisions on his own that suggested he was trying to genuinely reckon with things rather than simply manage the surface of them. I told him plainly and without drama. I told him I loved him and that the provisions for my grandchildren were not a punishment, but a protection. I told him that if he rebuilt, not for my approval, but for himself, I would revisit the documents. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "I understand." He didn't say he agreed. He didn't say he was fine with it. He said he understood. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. There's a word for what I think he learned, eventually, after all of it. After the marriage fell apart, after the financial reckoning, after the long Sunday phone calls where we talked past midnight about money and pride and what we think other people's opinions are worth. The word is earn, not in the transactional sense, in the deeper one. The idea that the things worth having are things you have actually worked toward, not things you assumed would be there because they'd always been there. I had earned everything I had. Every dollar, every property, every decision to not spend the money I could have spent. I had earned the peace I felt on that December morning driving home from my attorney's office. My son was going to have to earn his way back too. Not to my money, to my trust. Those are different things, and I had spent too many years confusing them. My daughter-in-law and I do not have much contact now. I see my grandchildren regularly. That was not negotiable, and my son has been good about it. She is civil to me when we are in the same room. I am civil to her. We have both, I think, arrived at a clear-eyed assessment of each other, and that clarity, even when it is not comfortable, is easier to live with than the performance of warmth that was never quite real. My house in Akron still has the original hardwood floors I refinished in 1995. I have a garden now. I always meant to, and retirement finally gave me the time. I drive the CRV. I have a standing dinner with 2 women I've known since we were all young mothers together, and we eat good food and drink decent wine and talk about everything and nothing. Last spring, I added to both of my grandchildren's 529 accounts. My grandson is in a gifted program and obsessed with dinosaurs. My granddaughter has recently decided she wants to be an architect. I bought her a book about women in architecture and mailed it with a note that said, "The buildings you design will outlast everything. Build something real." She called me to say thank you. She said, "Grandma, it's the best present I ever got." She's 7 years old. She said it with complete conviction. I thought about my daughter-in-law's face over the Thanksgiving table, the careful, pitying recalibration behind her eyes when she said even small amounts help. I thought she had no idea what she was looking at. Most people don't. That's all right. I do. I used to think the hardest thing about being underestimated was the loneliness of it, the way you sit across a table from people who love you or say they do, and watch them look right through everything you've built, as if it isn't there. My daughter-in-law didn't say anything cruel that Thanksgiving. That's the part I've turned over the most. She said it kindly. Even small amounts help, with the patient smile of someone explaining something obvious to someone who hasn't quite caught up yet, and my son sat there and let her. That's what actions are, really. Not the dramatic ones, not the slammed doors or the raised voices. The quiet ones. The not saying anything. The shrug. The moment someone chooses comfort over honesty, and you watch them make that choice, and you finally stop pretending you didn't see it. I think about cause and effect a lot more now than I used to. Not in any mystical sense, just practically. The way my daughter-in-law had been careless with money for years because no one had ever required her to be careful. The way my son had learned to manage appearances instead of substance, because appearances had always been enough to get him what he wanted. The way I had stayed quiet through all of it because I told myself that love meant letting people find their own way. Those were choices. Every one of them had a consequence, and the consequences arrived on a February afternoon when my son called me, voice different from the first word, to tell me that the thing he'd built on, borrowed confidence, was coming apart. What I want to say to anyone listening is this. The life you build quietly is not invisible. It is the only kind that lasts. Integrity isn't a concept I think about in the abstract. For me, it looks like a blue insulated lunch bag. It looks like a library VHS tape on home plumbing. It looks like a difficult tenant who turned out to be a reasonable woman once someone listened to her. It looks like 30 years of decisions that nobody saw and nobody applauded, and nobody put on the kind of social media that my daughter-in-law consulted when she planned her centerpieces. Character is what you do when the only person watching is yourself, and it accumulates the same way interest does, slowly and then all at once. Intelligence, too, is not what people perform. It's what they pay attention to. I paid attention to how money moved. I paid attention to the difference between what my son said and what his eyes did when he said it. I paid attention to my granddaughter when she said she wanted to be an architect because that was information worth holding on to. Smart isn't always loud. Sometimes smart is the woman in the old Buick who already knows something you haven't figured out yet. And then there's the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. The kind that gets up and tiles its own bathroom and drives home on a dark interstate without crying and sits in an attorney's conference room on a cold January morning and signs the papers with a steady hand. That strength is not dramatic. It is just persistent. It shows up every day and does the work and does not wait to be seen doing it. My son is rebuilding. It is slow and it is real, and I am watching without comment, the way I watched Mr. Schaefer by his second location and his third. Some things you cannot rush. Some things you cannot rush. Some things you can only wait for and be available when they arrive. My granddaughter wants to be an architect. She's 7 years old and she means it. I believe her. Build something real. That's the whole lesson. That's all of it.